Good evening, everyone. We're going to call a meeting to order. We're going to start with our land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge that the ground on which we live is the traditional territory of Caldwell First Nation, of the Three Fires Confederacy, and the original people of Point Pelee and Pelee Island and its surrounding lands and waters, and that of the Huron, Wendat, and Wyandot peoples. We recognize and respect the First Nations who are stewards of the land and waters of Turtle Island and who have embraced this stewardship since time immemorial. We would also like to acknowledge the contributions of other nearby First Nation communities and all original people across Turtle Island. We will now have a moment of silent reflection, followed by the playing of the national anthem. Okay, if we can get an adoption of the agenda for June 27th, 2023. Councillor Riccio Spagnolo, support by Councillor Carrick. All in favor? That carries. Any disclosures of community interest? There being none, can we get an adoption of the minutes from the council meeting held June 13th, 2023? Councillor Burns and Councillor Reno, all in favor? That carries. You know, and I didn't print out my mayor's comments tonight, and I had them handy. So just give me 1 second here to open them. I can get this to work quickly for me. Okay, so the town of LaSalle is proud to have hosted the Tourism Windsor Essex Pelee Island annual general meeting, which was this month at our event center. So check out TWEPI's website and social media pages for summer events and things happening in our region. LaSalle Night Markets changed our location this past Sunday, and I want to thank staff for being on top of that as quickly as you were. The information was shared with social media, all the vendors and attendees very quickly, and I think we still had a great turnout for the event, so thank you for that. And we have, I believe, 3 more scheduled, for 2 to take place here, for sure, and then 1 back at the event center in September. The school year is coming to an end, so we want to wish all of our students a fun and safe summer. And with that comes obviously good news of the outdoor pool being open, which should be Sunday, July 2nd. And this year, Pathway to Potential is sponsoring recreational swims, and that means free swimming sessions are daily from 2 to 4 p.m. And registration is recommended, so visit our website for that information. And then we have something new this year called Parks Power Hour. Actually, I don't know, did we do that in the past? We did. So the town is offering free 1-hour recreational programs in the parks on Tuesdays and Thursdays in July and August, which is sponsored by Essex Powerlines Corp and held at the Vollmer Complex. And again, registration is required for this event. On the weekend, We had lots of events going on throughout the town. I think all members of council were very busy attending events and things in the community. I was able to participate in the Haggis Hurl at the Kingsville Highland Games, and I did not embarrass myself. I was the first winner, first loser, so I did really well. But it was a great event, and we've had a lot going on in the community, and I just want to thank all of council for being out there and involved, because I know there's a heck of a lot going on. With that, we'll move on to presentations and delegations. Item number 1, which is the proposed National Urban Park, and I'm going to turn that over to Ms. Beggs.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of council. Tonight we're actually fortunate enough to have a representative from Parks Canada to provide an update for us on where we're at with the National Urban Park project and the town of LaSalle's involvement in it. As council is aware, Mr. Mara and I have been working with Parks Canada over the last year and a half on the National Urban Park project. We've been part of what's called the Partner Committee, which has a number of representatives from different stakeholder groups, including the City of Windsor, Ministry of Transportation, MECP, representative from First Nations, including Walpole Island, as well as the Caldwell First Nations group. And our objective at this moment is to consider some additional lands in the town of LaSalle for inclusion in the National Urban Park. Those lands include the Rio Prairie, Stanton Woods, LaSalle Woodlot, which includes Brunette Park, portions of land along Turkey Creek, the Town Center Woodlot, and Villa Maria Woodlot. And we're at the stages in the process where those lands are being considered and in the pre-feasibility stages. So pre-feasibility studies are being undertaken by the consultant to explore whether or not those lands meet the criteria for inclusion in the National Urban Park project. So with that, I'll turn it over to Miriam. Miriam Podolsky is here from Parks Canada, and Miriam is the Director of Urban Parks and Ecological Corridors. Welcome, Miriam.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Beggs, and thanks for your collaboration on this project so far, to you and Mr. Mara. And also wanted to say thank you to the mayor and the councillors for the opportunity to present to you this evening. Really appreciate it. I want to introduce my colleague, Sunya Kwan, who's the project lead from Parks Canada for the National Urban Park initiative in Windsor. So we do have a presentation that we were going to share today. So I'm going to just ask Sunya if she can put it up on the screen. Hopefully you can let me know if you can see it okay.
I'm having difficulty. It says that the host disabled attendee screen sharing, so I'm not sure if that can be rectified.
Well, maybe okay. Just wait 1 minute to see if we can fix that. If not, I can just start speaking to it verbally, but yep, hopefully we can get the presentation up so you can see it.
Give us 1 second, we're just checking. Should be able to now? Okay, if you want to try now.
Okay. Okay, I will, it says share entire screen. I will go ahead and do that.
Great, Hopefully thank you. Yeah. Okay, great. So I understand I have about 15 minutes to present, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So what I was going to do was just give you a little bit of context first about the National Urban Park program in general. We're working in a number of different cities across Canada. So just wanted to share with you a little bit of that national context. And then I would drill down and talk more specifically about the specific site in Windsor and our work with LaSalle. So we can just jump right into it, Sunya. So I'll start with the national part of the program. So our work on this began in 2020. There was a reference in the speech from the throne about the importance of ensuring access to green space for Canadians living in urban centers. And I think we all sort of experienced during the pandemic that great importance and desire to have green spaces to access in cities. And so our program launched in August of 2021. We had one of our announcements of the launch of the program held in Windsor, which was very exciting. And we're building on the success of the first National Urban Park, which predated the program, the Rouge National Urban Park outside Toronto. Next slide, please. So this slide gives just a kind of a long list of the many benefits of national urban parks. And so, of course, they protect nature, they give opportunities for people to connect with nature that leads to sort of well-being benefits and health benefits. There are also opportunities to advance reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and I can talk about that a little bit in a minute. They're also really important in terms of jobs and economic opportunities. So Parks Canada has seen in places where we have Parks Canada places that it can really bring a lot of benefits to the community. And, you know, also educational opportunities to learn about nature and participate in programs and things like that. So there's many benefits of a national urban park. Next slide. So as I said, we're working in a number of different cities across Canada, and our goal is to designate 5 national urban parks by 2025. There's a range of different possible governance options for these national urban parks. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We really anticipate that each national urban park is going to be unique and driven by sort of local partnerships and local considerations. And we are taking a very collaborative approach and a kind of a partnership-based approach for creating these different national urban parks. Slide. So this is a map that just shows you some of the different cities that we're working in. You can see there's a big geographic diversity all across Canada, and they're all at kind of different stages and advancing at their own pace, driven by the sort of local circumstances and the work with different partners. So our work on the National Urban Parks program is leading us to designate these national urban parks under a policy, and that policy is under development. You may have heard that we recently published a policy discussion paper to get input towards the creation of that National Urban Parks policy, which we're aiming to release in early 2024. So this slide just gives you kind of a preview of how the policy is organized and our main objectives for the program, which are nature, connecting people with nature, and reconciliation. And, you know, there's lots of small words on that page, so you don't need to see all of it, but all those details are found in the policy discussion paper that can be found on the Parks Canada website. It was also shared with our counterparts in the town of LaSalle. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there's a range of possible governance options for national urban parks, and we anticipate that each one will be unique. So it could be a federally administered national urban park, which is what the Rouge is. It could be a partnership model, or it could be administered by other partners, be they municipal, provincial, an Indigenous partner, or even private lands like a land trust or a conservation authority. So there's a range of options, and which option is selected is determined based on the local circumstances. Next slide, please. I mentioned that one of the program objectives is advancing reconciliation, and this is a big priority for the program. So Parks Canada is committed to working on a nation-to-nation basis with Indigenous partners, and we are doing that at each candidate site where we're working. And we are in discussions about co-management, where there's an interest from Indigenous partners in advancing that form of governance, of co-governance and co-management. Next slide, please. Sometimes we get asked, you know, what does this mean? What could co-governance look like? So again, this is a dialogue with Indigenous partners, and we want to hear and listen and co-create the approach. But you can define co-governance as a shared vision and understanding between partners about governance and management. And it has to be developed collaboratively with Indigenous partners, reflecting Indigenous systems of knowledge, law, and governance. And there's more information in our policy discussion paper about the reconciliation components of the National Urban Parks program. And those are out there for comment and input. So they're there to seek feedback before we finalize the National Urban Parks policy. And next slide, please. Okay, so that was an overview of sort of the national program. I just wanted to give that context. And now I'm going to talk more about the specific work in the Windsor area in terms of the Canada 8 National Urban Park site in Windsor. So we'll go through a couple of slides for that. So in terms of status where we're at, we have been working on it for some time and had great collaboration from partners, and particularly want to recognize the great contributions of the officials from the town of LaSalle, which has been much appreciated. We have started work in the planning phase, although as Ms. Beggs noted at the beginning, there is still some pre-feasibility work related to aspects of the project that were added more recently, like the proposed inclusion of LaSalle lands. But overall, we are in the planning phase for our journey to designate a national urban park. And so some of the partners who we're working with are Caldwell First Nation, Walpole Island First Nation, of course, the town of LaSalle, City of Windsor, Province of Ontario, Hydro One, and Parks Canada. And so, as was mentioned at the beginning, we have a partner committee of all of these jurisdictions and Indigenous rights holders who are providing sort of the guidance, leadership, doing a lot of the work and analysis to get ready for the designation as a national urban park. And that includes leading engagement with stakeholders and the public. Next slide, please. So this is a map of what we call the study area. So this is the area that we're looking at as part of the possible lands that could be designated as part of the National Urban Park. And so the study area was expanded as part of that pre-feasibility process to include town of LaSalle lands. And again, this is a study area, so it doesn't mean that any final decisions have been taken. It just means that these are the lands that we're studying for potential inclusion into the park. And so, you know, we wanted to mention, for example, the parcels along Turkey Creek and other parklands that include habitat for the endangered Massasauga rattlesnake are particularly, you know, valuable and of interest from a conservation perspective. And as we discuss, you know, the future decisions about the boundaries of the park, everything will be done in dialogue with the jurisdictions, landowners, and land managers. There is one parcel which is currently owned by Parks Canada, so you probably read about that in the news, but the Ojibwe Shores parcel was transferred from the Windsor Port Authority to Parks Canada. And so we are now administering that parcel. As I said, we've been doing sort of public and stakeholder engagement around this. Most recently, we had a successful public open house on June 13th that was held at the LaSalle Event Center. And overall, we've heard a lot of enthusiasm and excitement and support for the project. We've heard generally that people feel there are benefits to residents for recreation and green space, as well as benefits for tourism and regional economic development, particularly with the profile of taking it to kind of a national level as a national urban park. And then, of course, benefits to increase ecological gains through coordinated management. So by sort of planning for these regions holistically, we can look at it sort of as an ecosystem-based approach. We did receive some questions about roadways through the park and, you know, the impacts on wildlife. And the reason we have a particular stream of work at Parks Canada for urban parks is that we recognize that in urban areas, there is major public infrastructure that plays an important role. And so we are mindful of striking a balance between the needs for urban functioning as well as other objectives of the program, like conservation. Next slide, please. This is just some pictures to enjoy a look at some of the parcels that are being considered for inclusion in the National Urban Parks. Don't need to spend too much time on that. Next slide, please. So one of the questions we get asked that I wanted to speak to a little bit is about the private members bill that's going through Parliament. It was tabled by MP Massey, and so we do often get asked about what's Parks Canada's role, how does our work relate to the parliamentary process. So I wanted to speak to that a little bit. Just before I get into those details, I'll say that Parks Canada is committed to the creation of a national urban park in Windsor. And so really, regardless of the route that's taken to create the park, Parks Canada will be there to implement this work. And, you know, we share that goal of creating this national urban park, whether it's established through the parliamentary process or through the Parks Canada process. Okay, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is a private members bill that was tabled by MP Massey. It was adopted in the House of Commons and it's currently in the Senate. So Parks Canada is following this process with interest, but we're not leading it. And our role will be to implement what Parliament decides. So it still has some steps to go through in terms of review by a Senate committee and votes in the Senate before it could receive royal assent. And what the bill does is it seeks to create a national urban park under legislation, so under the Canada National Parks Act, and it sets out the coordinates of that national urban park if the legislation were to be passed. And so those coordinates that are included in the private members bill, those parcels of land would transfer to the administration of Parks Canada. And so those lands would be subject to sort of the legislation and regulations of the Canada National Parks Act. So the town of LaSalle lands are not included in the coordinates of the private members bill as it was tabled in Parliament. So they wouldn't automatically be included within the National Urban Park through that parliamentary process, unless there was some kind of amendment or change as it was moving through Parliament. But currently the LaSalle lands are not included in the coordinates in the bill. Under the Canada National Parks Act in general, there is a process to change the boundary of a national park, so it can always be amended, it can be expanded, other lands can be added in the future, but it has to go through a separate parliamentary process. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, our initiative in Windsor launched in 2021, and so we are continuing to pursue the designation of the National Urban Park under policy. And, you know, these are complementary mechanisms. Our policy sets out the sort of objectives that we're aiming to seek, the way that we want to collaborate with partners. So really, as I said, either way that the park is created, Parks Canada can be there to implement what is decided. Next slide, please. So I'll just walk through some of the different parcels and how they may be different under the private members bill as compared to the study area. As I said, the study area is a study area, meaning that we're looking at it, we're assessing it, but no decisions have been taken really under either process. So this is just where we're at the current step of the process. So the City of Windsor lands that are in the private members bill, there's about 240 hectares, and then the study area, it's about double that, 480 hectares, and that's really due to a larger area for Spring Garden and Tallgrass Prairie Heritage Park, as well as additional parks that are included in the study area, like Malden Park, South Cameron Natural Areas, and Oakwood Park. Next slide, please. The province of Ontario lands. So in the private members bill, there's about half of the Ojibwe Prairie Provincial Nature Reserve, whereas in the study area, we have the full Provincial Nature Reserve, as well as Chapas that are part of that study. Next slide, please. So town of LaSalle lands. So as I mentioned, the town of LaSalle lands are not included in the private members bill unless there is some sort of amendment brought forward either during the Senate study or in the future, Parliament could change the boundary of the park. There is a parliamentary process for that, but currently it's not included. However, there are parcels that are being studied in collaboration with the town of LaSalle and other partners for potential inclusion in the National Urban Park designation. And we have heard a lot of interest from First Nation partners about Turkey Creek in particular as a wetland and as another waterfront connection. So in terms of next steps, if you can just go to the next slide, Sonia, thank you. So as I emphasized, Parks Canada is really committed to continuing these discussions, and we're really appreciative of the collaboration with the town of LaSalle and other partners. We've also really appreciated all the public and stakeholder engagement that's been provided. It's really important in terms of providing input to the vision for the park, and most recently that great open house that was held in LaSalle. We are having nation-to-nation discussions with First Nations partners about the possibility of co-management of the park. And we are also doing sort of formal consultation as the federal crown with First Nations. Some of the tasks that we're going to be working on in the planning phase include refining the vision for the park, finalizing the park boundary, and confirming the governance model. We'll be starting to develop a draft budget and identifying possibilities for investments, and then beginning operational planning. And as I said, we're aiming to designate 5 parks by 2025. We do expect the Windsor one to be one of the ones that's created by 2025, or potentially even earlier, depending on how quickly the process advances from here. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to present today, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Councillor Carrick.
So I have a little bit to say here. I just want to make sure that I get this right. And I know we're part of the, we're in the planning phase and consultation phase, but this is more poignant toward our town. So, and I think the potential, the opportunity here is awesome. Down the road, I think it'd be protected, the lands, whatever this involves, would be a great opportunity for us, and that it would be protected forever. And that the fact that my children's children, et cetera, wouldn't have to worry about it ever disappearing, especially if it got to the federal stage. So just bear with me here. I have a little bit to say here. That's okay, Your Worship. So the first point is the existing individual park names in LaSalle should be maintained for references and recognition, such as Bernard Park and Stanton Woods. So is that considerations we'll also be taking in, looking at, so the names of the parks that are already there will remain there for our own history? Would that be something we're going to look at? Through Your Worship.
I'm not sure if that's something you're able to answer today.
Or you can take it into consideration, like for your summaries, review. I'm just asking.
Just a protocol. Would you like me to respond, or should we wait till the end?
You can wait till the end if you want. I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that. That's okay with you, Your Worship.
Well, you might as well respond while you're going.
Okay.
Sure, okay.
How about responding now then? Through Your Worship.
Yeah. So we're in a planning process, so that's like great feedback to hear. And again, we're not at a decision-making point yet, but I think we can take note of that point and definitely bring it back and consider it in terms of the value of those names for local history. So just kind of want to thank you for bringing that to our attention, and definitely something that we can discuss as we move forward together.
Okay, so, and then my second point, I got 3 points altogether. Basically, our lands, or residents currently enjoy our lands and our parks. And the fact that our park systems, it is important that our residents get to continue to enjoy these lands in the manner that they do today. If they should the lands become part of the National Urban Park as paved trails, playgrounds, open maintained spaces, pavilions, et cetera. So again, I'm sure that's part of the vision, but we just want to make sure that you're hearing it from us, that that's still going to be our opportunities and that's not going to go away.
Yeah, so again, like sort of the same comment. Thank you for kind of raising the considerations that are important. And definitely one of our goals is for people to connect with nature. So those recreational opportunities are for sure part of the discussion. And we want to hear from you, I guess, on what those priorities are for each specific parcel, if it's included, and how that fits into the overall vision.
Okay, so working with our administration closely and council would be appropriate at that time, right? That's good. The last but not least, okay, so once it's determined that the LaSalle lands will formally be part of the National Urban Park, hopefully that's the case, or some other form that protects it, the LaSalle Council will be given the opportunity to be informed at that point of time, and that all other supporting information such as land ownerships, maintenance, and use agreements, et cetera, be presented to this council for final consideration on the lands that are owned by LaSalle. So in other words, as we keep moving forward, I know we're still in the initial stages, I'm past that probably, but we have the opportunity to be able to be informed of what's brought back to us before it's actually finalized. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then again, might be potentially a great opportunity to protect it forever. So I would definitely look forward to seeing this move forward. Thank you. Thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor Reno.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you. I just wanted to thank the delegates for tonight, as well, more importantly, for the last meeting we had at the event center. It was well attended, and there were a lot of questions flying back and forth, and there were some answers out there. And I know, personally, I sent some residents down there for answers, and a few of them got the answers they were looking for. So thank you very much for continuing to engage with the public, and I hope to see another one of those sessions soon.
Any other questions or comments? Councillor Burns?
I guess our parks are assets, and are you prepared to give us fair market value for our parks, or is this part of your business plan? Residents have bought this land with tax dollars, and just to give it to the Government of Canada, I'm not sure if I would agree with that. I understand joint ownership and partnerships, but again, you're talking a few $1 million in land that we, as taxpayers who've lived here for a couple hundred years, have assembled, and this town has spent millions of dollars doing that. So that would be a concern for me as to what, besides saving everything, is in place now as we speak. So what is the bill, or is there any compensation that the taxpayers would get for forming this partnership with you, no matter who the operating agent is? Or do you know that? Yes, through the mayor. Thank you.
Yeah, and we really value and appreciate the sort of foresight and investment that LaSalle and other municipalities have made in protecting these lands and stewarding them. So we haven't made any determinations about the governance. So it's not necessarily a requirement that lands would be transferred to Parks Canada under our National Urban Park program. So there is an option to have a collaboration or a partnership without lands changing hands. The parliamentary process, if the lands were to be scheduled under the Canada National Parks Act, then the administration would go to Parks Canada. Although, as I said, currently the LaSalle lands are not included in those private member bill coordinates. So a long story short, all of this would be something to discuss and agree upon together. We're not at that point yet.
Thank you for your response.
Any other questions or comments? Administration, anything to add? No. I too want to thank you for not just the presentation, but attending our event center for the open house. It was very well attended, and I know we have a lot of residents who are excited about the potential of this project, but do have some questions, more or less surrounding the governance of that property. My only question to you is, I know we're in the pre-feasibility stage of determining lands. What is approximately that timeline before we would know if any of the LaSalle lands were to be considered?
Yeah, so the parliamentary process follows its own calendar, so it's a little bit difficult for us to say how long it may take. It sort of depends how long the Senate decides to study the bill for, and it has to go through various votes. Our target is to designate the park by 2025. So we anticipate those kinds of decisions would probably be made in, I guess before then, 2024, 2025. It depends on the process that's taken to create the park.
Okay. Are we good? No other comments, questions? Again, thank you very much for joining us tonight and for your presentation. And thank you to staff for continuing to work hard on this file with Parks Canada. So with that, it is item I1 in our agenda. If anyone would like to flip to that one there, and then we could receive that item.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today and for your comments. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Councillor Carrick, motion to receive. And support Councillor Regis Bagnolo, all in favor? And that carries. Thank you again for joining us. We'll move on to G, there's no public meetings or hearings. So H is our reports and correspondence for council's action, with item 1 being the 2022 audited financial statements. Mr. Ferraro.
Good evening, Mayor, members of council. The report before you seeks approval on the 2022 town annual financial statements. The financial statements are prepared internally by our staff and audited by a third party, our external auditors, KPMG, in accordance with the Municipal Act. It is a significant undertaking that we have to complete the financials with a lot of staff resources and within finance, as well as preparing any responses to any inquiries by KPMG. So saying that, Ms. Denbach from KPMG is here to provide a brief presentation on the statements, and then we'll be available for any questions.
Okay, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I am sharing my screen right now, which contains our audit findings report. So what I would like to do for council is just walk through the highlights of our audit findings. And if you've had a chance to look through it already, you will see there are not a lot of highlights to go over, which is a good thing as far as audits are concerned. So I'll just briefly stop on this page to point out that the audit has been completed. We are independent from the town, as we are required to be under Canadian auditing standards. There are no corrected or uncorrected audit misstatements that were identified as part of our audit. And if you look to the bottom right box there, which says materiality, I'll just point out for you the materiality threshold that we used for the year was just over $2 million, which was comparable to last year. But really what that means is if we came across any audit differences that were greater than our audit misstatement posting threshold of $103,000, that's the level at which we would report back to council through this report. And pleased to report that there were none identified. In terms of the status of the audit, when we prepared this document a few weeks back, there were a couple of items outstanding. Most of those items have now been completed. So the only remaining items that are outstanding before we anticipate being able to issue a clean or an unmodified auditor's report would simply be having our conversations with council here today, obtaining evidence of council's approval of the financial statements, at which point we will send a management representation letter to management to have signed, and that will allow us to finalize the audit. I won't go over, we didn't identify any control deficiencies during our audit, and as I mentioned, also didn't identify any audit misstatements. So not a whole lot else to touch on here. I will point out, if you have read through the financial statements themselves, you will see there was some note disclosure included around upcoming accounting standard changes. So there are some public sector accounting standard changes coming down the pipeline, some of which are fairly significant. And I have provided some additional detail in the appendices of our report for you, just so that you can have an understanding of what makes up those accounting standard changes. So those are included here in this Appendix C. And that's really all I wanted to highlight for council, and I'm happy to take questions if anybody has them.
Thank you very much. Administration, anything you'd like to add before we go to council?
Nothing to add. You know, Katie and her team's been on this engagement for quite a number of years. You know, it goes fairly smoothly. It's one piece of paper that's issued, but there's hours and hours of work that go into preparing a clean file for KPMG. So I don't have anything much to add other than that.
Thank you. Members of council, questions or comments? None? Well, all right. So with that, we are looking for a approval and adoption of the 2022 audited financial statements.
So moved.
Moved by Councillor Burns, support Deputy Mayor. All in favor? That is carried. Thank you very much for joining us this evening and for all your hard work as well as administration.
Thank you.
Item number 2 now, Howard Bouffard Secondary Plan Boundary. Ms. Beggs.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. As you'll recall, back in April, council approved the reinitiation of the Howard Bouffard Secondary Plan. And at that same meeting, we contracted the planning partnership to assist with that effort. Mr. Palmer has been involved in the town of LaSalle in the past. He has worked with us on our official plan, which was adopted in 2018, as well as our comprehensive zoning bylaw adopted in August of 2021. So at that meeting of council where we reinitiated the secondary plan, we also committed to coming back to council to establish the appropriate secondary plan boundary for the Howard Bouffard Planning District. And what we did at that meeting is we presented a study area and we committed to working in consultation with Mr. Palmer and his group from the planning partnership to refine that study area into an appropriate boundary. So we are now ready to recommend an appropriate boundary for the Howard Bouffard secondary plan, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Palmer, who will walk us through how that boundary was established and the criteria for putting that boundary in place.
Thank you, Gudrun. I'm hoping you can put the, oh, perfect. And I'm hoping you can hear me tonight. Since last time that didn't work out. Is everything working?
All good.
Excellent. I did do a test this afternoon to make sure that would all work out today. Can you go to the first slide, please? As Gudrun mentioned, we've reinitiated the secondary plan process for Howard Bouffard secondary plan area, which is quite a large part of the town of LaSalle. We did commit to come back to council with a refined study area boundary that reflects some changes that have happened since the last secondary plan was prepared some 20 or so years ago. So we have been working with your staff to talk about what logical adjustments to that boundary would be. And in the upcoming couple of maps, I'm going to talk about what we've come upon. Next slide, please. So this map identifies, first of all, in red, the red line is the proposed recommended secondary plan boundary. You'll also notice that there are some areas that are shaded in yellow. And those are the areas we propose to remove from the formal secondary plan area because they are either already developed or are under development at the moment, or are already subject to plan of subdivision and or zoning bylaw approvals. In effect, they're already well along in the process and don't need to be a key part of the secondary plan study. In fact, they become elements of the plan that we need to respond to, not to plan for. So we propose that they come out of the formal secondary plan because of existing development or existing approvals. You'll also note way up at the top that there's an area shaded in green. And that area, which I believe is a town-owned parcel that is part of the natural heritage system, we've added that into the study area so we can have a look at it, review it as part of the comprehensive evaluation of the natural heritage system and understand its potential role for environmental protection, potentially for parts of the trail network, or even some passive open space uses. So going to the next slide, that is simply what we suggest as our preferred secondary plan area boundary. And if you, these particular lands then do become, anything within the boundary, become the subject of the secondary plan itself, which will be part of an official plan amendment, and also where we will be applying the provisions of the zoning bylaw. Next slide. This slide shows what we call in purple, in the shaded purple area, adjacent lands. We wanted to show you that to ensure and to tell you that, notwithstanding that they're not part of the formal secondary plan area, they are certainly important areas of land to provide context for preparing various alternative land use plans for the secondary plan area. They aren't a formal part of what will be the secondary plan or official plan amendment or any potential zoning changes, but it's certainly important for us to consider them to ensure that we are establishing appropriate transitions to those existing or planned land uses, and that they are properly integrated with the new secondary plan. Very importantly, they are not part of the statutory element of this plan. And I think with that, if you want to go to the last slide, I think we're happy to try and answer any questions that you might have and go from there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Administration, is there anything you'd like to add before we go to council?
I don't think so. I think tonight we're just looking for council to endorse the proposed boundary that Mr. Palmer and administration has worked to establish. And if that boundary is endorsed by council, then we will continue on with the secondary plan exercise.
Thank you. Members of council, questions about the secondary plan? Councillor Carrick, or sorry, Councillor Reno, you do? Okay.
The question I have is for the corridor that you're taking outside the area, which would be the purple line, I believe. Or is there any of that property that under the old plan would have developable rights?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's a really good question. We looked at those lands in purple, and many are already given appropriate development rights through the official plan and zoning bylaw. The reason that we took them out was because we felt that those two planning documents already provide significant and appropriate development potential that does not need to be considered for change through this process.
Thank you.
Councillor Reno.
Thank you, Your Worship. My question is in concern to the letter that we received, or that you received, concerning the triangular piece of property. Could you just explain how that works itself through?
Again, through you, Madam Mayor, I'll start on this one. Gudrun, if you want to add anything to the end. I want to start the answer to that question because it's, first of all, a really good question and a little bit complex. We have to remember that the purpose of the secondary plan has two objectives. The first objective of the purpose is to promote comprehensive planning. And the idea of comprehensive planning is to look at the entire area to understand how elements of stormwater management, something very important here in the town of LaSalle, as well as the development and allocation of sewer and water services, the road network, where schools go, where parks and trails go, what the natural heritage system is that needs to be protected, and what the land use distribution, including the distribution of density, is dealt with. The triangular lands are a very large piece of property and are pretty important to the overall comprehensiveness of what we're trying to do here. The second objective of this exercise is to both facilitate and expedite approvals once this work is done. It's really important to remember that we're promoting land use and density distribution, as well as doing a host of important technical studies from an engineering and natural heritage perspective that will, once we're finished, inform decisions on zoning and ultimately development approval. The key is that there are huge benefits to all the individual landowners to be part of this process. Certainly, we can never tell a landowner that they can't apply whenever they want for development through an official plan amendment and or the rezoning process and or through the draft plan of subdivision condominium processes. However, if a landowner or a group of landowners wish to go alone outside of the secondary plan, they are responsible for doing all the same significant studies on their own, keeping in mind that it all still needs to fit within the context of an overall plan. So removing significant areas out of the secondary plan study area, first of all, reduces the level of comprehensiveness of the town's own work, and in my opinion, frustrates the approach to creating the appropriate environment for speedier and less controversial development approvals once we are finished. And I have to tell you that in my career, when I embark upon a secondary plan, I usually find landowners wanting to be included rather than excluded. And the reason for that is that the town is preparing all the comprehensive work, not only from a land use planning perspective, but also from an engineering perspective, which in effect reduces the time and cost to individual landowners for approval once we are complete.
Okay. I don't know, Gudrun, if there's anything you need to add to that.
Well, I think that was a pretty comprehensive answer. I think all the important touch points were hit on. I will, just to loop back to Councillor Renault's question, I will say that following receipt of the letter regarding the Triangle lands, we did have a meeting with that development group to talk through some of these items that Mr. Palmer has highlighted, and to talk through some of the overall benefits of the secondary plan, and to talk through, you know, how essentially it was advancing the properties for development. And at the end of the process, we were going to go back and hard zone the properties in keeping with the secondary plan designation. So I think with the benefit of that explanation, and the fact that there's nobody here this evening, I think we can say that they now understand it a little bit better, and they're willing to participate, I hope, in that process.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to add to that, I did have the opportunity to speak with a few of those developers, and I don't think they fully understood what that secondary plan was, or that it was actually going to benefit them. they thought it was just going to delay their project, when in all actuality, at the end of the day, this is going to already have zoning in place for them. It's going to reduce their costs, and if anything, it may help them have more capacity in their development than if they were to be on the outside. We may be giving them a smaller number to develop than had they been a secondary plan, and we have it all laid out, and then we understand what the capacity would be allowed for each developer. So I think administration did a great job speaking with those individuals, and like you said, they're not here tonight, so I think they must be happy with that response. Councillor Carrick?
Thank you, Your Worship. So once we pass this tonight, I'm assuming we will, hopefully. Next steps, when we go together, we get the groups together, the developers together, that'll involve the drainage portion of this, because that's a huge issue. Am I understanding that correctly?
To you, Madam Mayor, absolutely true. I can tell you that our next step is my business partner and I are coming to LaSalle July 17 and 18, and we intend to meet with all the developers who wish to meet with us and all the agencies and departments of the municipality who are available to meet with us. I can tell you that there are 2 layers that are the first layers that go on this plan. Those are the natural heritage system and the strategy for dealing with stormwater management and drainage. Those are 2 fundamental elements of the plan, and there's been a lot of work done on those elements, and we certainly start from there.
Thank you very much. Good. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so before you, there are 3 parts to the recommendation. The first is that the May 25, 2023 PD 16-2023 regarding the Howard Bouffard Secondary Plan area boundary be received, and that the recommended secondary plan boundary for the Howard Bouffard District be approved, and that Council authorize administration with the assistance of the Planning Partnership to apply the recommended secondary plan boundary when completing the Howard Bouffard Secondary Plan. Moved by Deputy Mayor Capada, support by Councillor Desjarlais. All in favor? That carries. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you very much for spending the time. Appreciate it.
Have a good night. Item 3, Essex Power Corporation 2023 Shareholder Annual Meeting. I don't know if you want to speak at all on that.
There's really not much to say. It's pretty self-explanatory. This is the same request that we get every year, requesting that the mayor be appointed to vote at the annual shareholders meeting.
Councillor Renaud, move. Okay, support. Councillor Carrick, all in favor? That carries. Item I, we already dealt with number 1, so we just have the summary of reports to council. Councillor Desjarlais, move. All right, support. Councillor Riccio Spagnolo, all in favor? That carries. Bylaws, we have just the one, which is 8802, a bylaw to assume certain lands on Plan 12M687 as part of 6th Concession Road. Can I get a first, second, third, and finally passed reading tonight? Councillor Carrick and Councillor Riccio Spagnolo, all in favor? That carries. Committee matters. Item 1, Essex County Council highlights for June 7th. Any questions or comments regarding those? Just get a motion to receive them. Councillor Carrick, Councillor Burns, all in favor? That carries as well. Any questions or statements by council members? Notice of motion? Okay. Confirmatory bylaw, that the confirmatory bylaw 8803 be given a first, second, and third reading and finally passed. Councillor Renaud and Councillor Desjarlais, all in favor? That carries. You have a schedule of meetings before you. Thank you for joining us again this evening. Thank you to anyone online. Have a great night. Meeting adjourned. Just say those words.